Nice. So, hello everybody. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about tools. Humans have used them for 2.6 million years, starting with our favorite pointy rocks, and have developed things to the point where we can send a telescope into space, and it can send us back images like this while it's still out there. I've been using tools a lot more recently, as I've just moved into a new apartment. But the specific and precise instrument I'm going to talk to you about today is not a hammer. What I want to talk to you about today is multiplayer playtesting. So, here's a timeline. From our favorite pointy rocks to the first images coming back from the James Webb Telescope. I'm going to point out that it's not to scale. And right about here is where I'm going to be talking. The period from 2011 to 2020, the last 2 years of which have been ravaged by the coronavirus pandemic. If you're watching this video in the future, hi, I hope it's over. I'm going to define the pandemic as March 2020 to present day, and the period from 2011 to 2020 as the pre-pandemic period. Why 2011, you may ask? Well, it's a prime number, and I like those. But it's also when I started playing multiplayer games, and I still get nostalgic about playing Modern Warfare 2 with friends in school. I'm hoping that you'll come away from this talk with some more insights on the following. How game studios ran multiplayer studies in the lab, several challenges that they faced running multiplayer playtests during the pandemic, and how they were overcome, and lastly, some very short musings on what I think the future holds for multiplayer testing. Okay, clicker, cool. So, straight into the pre-pandemic period. How did game studios run multiplayer playtests back then? A lot of people in this room probably know that, but it's a similar enough process to recording an orchestra. And that's what I used to do before I worked in gaming. I spoke with some researchers about how playtests are run in the lab, and I could not believe the similarities. Firstly, you need a big room. You need a lot of people, and you need some specialized recording equipment. This poses a set of challenges that include, but are not limited to, finding that big room, organizing the logistics of getting everybody in here. I think Celia definitely knows about that from getting everybody in here just now. And lastly, we had a pretty big teardown procedure in the studio, but I've never heard of a playtesting lab where you need to polish a Steinway after every session. Some of the other issues that were surfaced with me regarding in-person testing are the following. Organizing food for that large group of people. Equipment failing. I've heard of a building losing power during a playtest. And the general logistics. Imagine running a multiplayer playtest for a battle royale game that has 100 people in it. And these obstacles are not just faced by the research team, but they're also faced by the players. Some of the other, sorry, that didn't go through. Buses, trains, traffic, the weather, all things that need to be considered, and all things that are outside of the player's control. Has anyone, just quick check, has anyone been to Ireland before, or do we have any other Irish people here? Cool, we've got a handful. Normally we're louder. Okay, so you're familiar with the rain then, right? And this is another little anecdote from working in the recording studio in Ireland, and something that I would think that any playtesting lab in Ireland would need to have set up. It's radiators beside the recording room to dry jackets. These challenges are very beneficial to overcome, though, as you're getting real-time feedback from the players. You're getting great insights. You're getting great security. You can have eyes on the back of players' heads while they're testing a game that no one is supposed to see yet. You can give great guidance. You can guide people away from certain sections of a map. I want you to remember that bit for later. But you need a big room, and you need lots of people. March 2020. two of the things become very difficult to do. A big room and getting lots of people in there. However, games still needed to be made, and according to everybody in this room anyway, they still needed to be play-tested. Right? Especially with the surge in popularity of multiplayer games during the pandemic. From Fortnite to Among Us to those quirky little quiz games that we played with our family. I played a lot of them with my aunties and uncles. And once the dust had settled on the pandemic, once we had kind of figured out like which windows we were allowed to look outside of, researchers tried multiple methods to get feedback from their players. From in-game surveys to playtesting portals, like you'll find on most, if not all, AAA studio websites. Friends and family playtests became very, very popular, and external playtesting vendors. All methods which had existed before, but were now the only tool that we could use. And that's where my experience running remote, unmoderated research was really tested. At the beginning of the pandemic, I was working as a research ops team lead. So it was my responsibility to make sure that all of the playtests were running on time and had enough people in them. That's the very basics of my job. At that time, before the pandemic, a big multiplayer playtest would be for around 20 people. By the peak of the pandemic, we were running multiplayer playtests for 50 to 100 people every weekend. This peaked in April 2021, when we had over 750 people participate in multiplayer playtests in that month. That's more than one big pre-pandemic playtest every day. So what did we learn? Well, the first thing is something that everybody knows is important, and that's communication. Communication, from playtest instructions to sometimes daily calls between the teams. This is especially true for those that were new to remote research. A quick preamble here on this is that even if you think that your communication and your communication strategy is on point, always have backups and redundancies in place. Then, prepare for them to not work at all. The story goes like this. I've been setting up a very involved playtest that had a room full of NDAs attached to it. Part of the requirements for the test was to have players play on their phones while they were in a Zoom call on their laptop. This was to ensure that they weren't doing any additional screen recording and to make sure that there was no one else in the room with them. This was a requirement from the studio. Some other details were that we wanted around 40 people to show up. A Zoom room breaks at 50, so we were all good on that. And they all needed to be very experienced with certain games. The players had been told in this screener, in the invitation email, in the scheduling email, in 3 scheduling reminder emails, and a text message that they needed to have a computer and a laptop. For anybody who that is not clear to, it looks like this. That's me. You'll come find me afterwards, talk about playtesting. We start the playtest, and everything looked pretty good on Zoom. The players are filing in. We're activating all their builds as this happens, and then I get a ping from the researcher. Hey, do you see player 4? I did. They were in their stationary car with not a laptop in sight. Fortunately, I had done some practice with my team earlier in the day. Not in a car, but we had done practice in Zoom rooms to figure out how all of the moderation features in that work, and we knew how to kick the player. It's a great note here to always have backups and redundancies in place if possible. And also, I would add another bit in there these days, prepare for them to not work. In that session, though, I had a great feeling of mutual respect and trust from the game team and the researcher. It's actually one of the precise reasons that that study happened at all. For the team I just mentioned, we had decided to not do a couple of studies beforehand, as we weren't ready yet. The game team weren't ready, the researcher wasn't ready, and we weren't ready. I'm happy to say that after that particular playtest, we set up a whole bunch of new processes for them to run more research. What's important to iterate here is that researchers and game teams need to trust each other in order to be able to work together. As often, if the game team is not comfortable running a study remotely, they probably shouldn't do it at all. As an external partner, it was really important for me to be very upfront with the researchers, producers, and the rest of the game team about this. To help them understand the pros and cons of running a study remotely was a big, big part of my job up front. After building that trust, we had to tackle the next challenge, which is taking a team's multiplayer playtesting playbook and tearing it apart. The team would no longer be able to be in the room with the player. They wouldn't be able to guide them through that part of the experience. They wouldn't need to set up 40 iPhones for each test, and they would have to relinquish a lot of the control that they would have in the lab. Remember that part for later. They could, however, still be there. They could still help with designing the recruitment surveys, and they could do it all from their own home, which they had to do during the pandemic. All this needed to be communicated up front, especially as later on many of these playtests were running at 3 a.m. in my local time zone. And after the first couple, I was sleeping soundly through the rest of the night. However, tearing up that playbook was one of the things I didn't even realize I was doing at the time. I hadn't thought of the people, processes, and procedures that were being affected. And the takeaway here is to be mindful and to always be understanding when working with new folks who could be subject matter experts in something but don't know what the specific thing that you're doing is. These people that I was working with had run hundreds of studies in the lab. They had never, ever ran one remotely before, something that I do on a daily basis. So it's really important to be very empathetic with these new people. I spoke a minute ago about relinquishing control, and I told you to remember it. And to expand on that point, I want to emphasize that in the lab, teams can access every device, every internet connection. They can, if they wanted to, they could test every game and set it back to 0 again. When we were running these tests, we were running it in a remote, unmoderated fashion, where we were delivering the game build to the player and having them open it for the first time when the multiplayer session was starting. Sure, we tested each build, and we would also test with the game team. We would have them test in a server and everything, but that doesn't account for every kind of problem. I spoke earlier about problems with the weather for going to an in-person test. When we're testing remotely, we don't know what someone's internet connection is like. And in a multiplayer setting, when we've got an hour to test the game, if you've got a pesky content downloader, which takes somewhere between 3 and 4 minutes to download everything on a very good internet connection, it's no problem. But it might take 15 or 20 minutes on a poorer internet connection, which is a bigger problem in Germany. We had one game which was very early in its development. And frankly, it was a marvel of modern computer engineering that we were able to get it to run on a phone at all. In that test, they wanted to guide people away from a certain section in the map. Remember from earlier when I was talking about the benefits of the lab, the benefits of that control? That was something that they would then need to relinquish in order for this test to happen at all. They wouldn't be able to guide people away from that certain section of the map. What would happen is if the player went into that, they would get stuck into an endless loop server side. So there's no way to save them. They're in purgatory. We communicated this to the players. in a very similar fashion to the way that we do for all of our playtests. Still, a few got stuck, but the playtest still happened, the research still happened, and because of that, the game team was able to understand how the players felt about the controls. The takeaway here is something that somebody said to me on a Zoom call when we were getting ready to set up this playtest. Something had gone awry, and it was one of my favorite moments from running all of these studies from my bedroom. The phrase that he used was, "That's game dev." And it perfectly encapsulates the challenges that we all face in making the best games possible and shows the resourcefulness of our community. Once the studio relinquished that control, they were actually able to do that study, and it was great. One of the other challenges that we faced was finding the right players. It's always been something that we've had to work very hard on. When it comes to multiplayer playtests, you have to find the right amount, and you have to find more of them. As it's a bigger challenge when you have servers that need to be filled and no bots yet. I've helped studios in many ways, from running screeners myself to supporting them bringing in their own players to creating a database of players with motivation profiles. Motivation profiles are very hot right now. And the latter, that bit resulted in a lot of work on the data management side of things because I didn't have any tooling for it and the researcher didn't have any tooling for it. It's actually where I learned this. It's sheets.new. How many people in the room know about that? Wow, you guys, you learned a lot today already. What this will do will open up a brand new spreadsheet in Google Chrome. It's awesome, right? What's not so awesome is how many spreadsheets I have called untitled spreadsheets now. It was incredibly important for us to be able to playtest with players who had good devices at the time. Remember, I spoke a little bit earlier about modern computer technology marvels, getting these things onto phones at all. Many of the games were not optimized at all. And what was really important for a lot of studios was getting players experienced with certain games, certain competitor games. I think that a part of this was down to usability issues, where players who are experienced with similar or competitor games will pick up controls a little bit easier when you don't have a full tutorial. There's also just the general appreciation. We know that they like these types of games already. It's always important to flesh out exactly what that target audience is, though. As we need people who play Call of Duty Mobile, or we want players who are experienced with Asphalt 9, mean vastly different things to different people. Great questions to ask here include, how often should people be playing that game to be considered experienced for you? And is there a certain rank in that game that you would like players to be at as a minimum? We would always screen for more players than we needed to have backups in place so they could simulate bots. Because in these playtests, sometimes you don't have enough people show up, but the match needs to start. And oftentimes, very early in development, multiplayer games won't have any bots ready at all. Come on, clicker. Towards the end of Q4 2021, we heard from a game studio that they were not seeing the same turnout for their tests. Those servers weren't getting as populated as they wanted them to be. And we could validate that with internal metrics, which compare how many players start a game versus some other data points. We weren't failing at the idea of the playtest, but we were trending towards that direction where we were going to have a problem. So I did what I've encouraged a lot of people to do, and I ran a survey to find out more about the players' habits and motivations, which led us to changing a couple of things around within the operations department. We changed the time we ran multiplayer playtests. We changed the time we sent invitations out, and we changed our reward strategy. The most interesting finding for me out of all of this was that players wanted less time before the playtest started to be invited to it, which seemed incredibly counterintuitive. I always thought they'd want more time. What was a little bit less surprising for me, though, was that they wanted a little bit more money added to the time-money equation. We're coming towards the end of this talk now, and I want to give those guesstimates that I spoke about at the start about what multiplayer playtesting could look like in the future. I think we're going to see a lot of people go back to testing in the lab for their bigger studies and then supplementing that with remote research. I'm very excited to see what the future holds there, and I'm very excited to see what the future holds for testing games in the metaverse, whether it is for games or whether it's for experiences like we've seen with Fortnite and Roblox. And by we, I mean the industry, by the way. Before we get into the questions, I want to take you back and recap on 3 of the takeaways from earlier that I think will have you running not only your playtest, but your organizations even better. Always be understanding when working with new folks who could be subject matter experts, but have not done the specific thing that you're doing before. Have backups and redundancies in place. Remember what they say in the military, 2 is 1 and 1 is none. And lastly, that's game dev. Thanks very much, everybody. This has been my favorite game of the year, Vampire Survivors. If you haven't played it yet, do it. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. Thanks, Celia.
Thanks, Jack. So the first question is from Andres. With COVID restrictions becoming a bit laxer, how is it decided which tests to do online and which ones to do remotely?
Your mic's here, sorry. I was holding a thing. So what we've seen and what I've seen in particular is that for studies where the researcher really needs to be there, Gesundheit, people will, Gesundheit, you're supposed to say something else in German, but I can't remember what it is now. Studies where things are complicated, so let's say a tutorial does not exist yet, or you need to guide people away from a certain section of a map, or otherwise they'll go into purgatory. Those kind of tests, I think, are going to be happening more in the lab as COVID restrictions ease up. That can all be supplemented with having remote research happening as well. And I think for quick appreciation tests and stuff, that will also likely stay in the remote world. It's really nice for researchers and game teams to not need to go into a lab and work all day with people that they've never met before. And yeah, that's my kind of guesstimate on that.
Are there any verbal questions that we can go to you? Okay. In the meantime, was the Zoom call rule enough to deter users from breaking NDAs?
Yes, I think so. What you're doing with the player when you're putting them under an NDA and telling them that they're going to be having their face recorded and the room recorded while everything is happening, they're generally not going to want to break that trust. What I've also seen a lot of researchers do is communicate very upfront and say that, hey, if you break that NDA and you leak this game, bad things happen for me. It's true. Anytime there's a massive leak, the first thing to get hit is user research. It's the first thing that, hey, people can't be interacting with this content yet. And there's no actual effect on the game development. It's a bit of a spicy take.
What have you found to be the ideal time for players from invitation to playtest? Have you found that any variables change that calculus?
Yeah, so what we have to consider is that we actually we're based in Berlin, right? So we send a lot of our playtest invitations out at a normal time for us, which could be anywhere from 3 in the morning to 11 o'clock in the morning on the Pacific, on the West Coast. So what players said that they wanted was less than 24 hours. There was a certain subsection of people that wanted it in less than 12 hours, but the vast majority wanted it in less than 24. For a little bit more context, we had been setting everything up 48 hours before the playtest was due to start.
Do you have any strategies for improving response rates on surveys?
Yes, actually, we send out a lot of screeners, right? And like look after at least 250 playtests every month. So there's a lot of screeners going out. And one of the project managers on the team, Martin, he took a really big interest in like he just wanted more people to answer his emails, right? He wanted more people to answer the screeners. We do it all via email. We don't do it on the platform at all. And the biggest thing that we noticed was adding emojis to the subject line. Yeah.
That's a good one. All right, we're gonna have to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Jack.
Thank you so much, Celia.